So what we're going to do in this video is go over some of the big major changes that are coming to The Last of Us Part 2. We recently got the release date of February 21st, 2020, which is very exciting, but we know that today is Outbreak Day, and because of that, we're going to be getting a ton of new information. We've even gotten new gameplay, which I should have looped in the background here, and it's really awesome to finally see some new gameplay, but with that, there's actually a bunch of new gameplay mechanics and a bunch of changes that Naughty Dog have made from the first game going into the sequel here. And we know that the press, the media, got 3 hours hands-on, and so what I want to do is make two separate videos, maybe even more than that depending on just how much information we get today. But the first video, I want to focus on some of the bigger changes to gameplay that I'm sure many of you are going to be interested in, and in the second video that I put out later today, I want to go over just the overall impressions that the media is coming away with after playing 3 hours of The Last of Us Part 2. Suffice to say, it's very good, but I really want to go in depth on that. I didn't want to combine it into two videos. But getting onto the gameplay changes here, starting with the first and most significant change that we're going to notice right away, apparently, when playing The Last of Us Part 2, when we finally get this game in our hands, is just how much bigger the environments are and how much more freedom you have within these environments and how many more options you're going to have at your disposal when it comes to enemy encounters. This is something that I've been seeing a lot of the media talking about when it comes to the biggest change they noticed right away, and this is something that apparently Naughty Dog has put a big emphasis on, and you can clearly see it within the gameplay itself. I mean, even the 2018 gameplay demo we got, you could just tell that these areas are going to be very big, and when you're taking on a lot of enemies in these big areas, you're going to have a lot of different ways you can choose to approach it. There's no doubt you are going to have to utilize stealth to some extent, and luckily as we go further down the changes mechanically that Naughty Dog has introduced to this game, you're going to find that some of these new mechanics are really going to help give you a major advantage when it comes to playing to stealth within this game. But yeah, that to me is something that I'm really going to be looking forward to. I think that when Naughty Dog says that this is their biggest game, they don't literally just mean in how long the game's going to be. We know it's going to be a very long game, the longest game they've ever made, but I would fully expect that that also means environments are going to sometimes maybe even make it seem like it's kind of open world without actually being open world. That's going to be really interesting to see. But the second thing we're going to talk about here, it seems really simple, but it's actually a big deal because you couldn't do this in the first game. You're actually able to jump now. That is a mechanic in the game. This is something that was missing from The Last of Us 1, and so in The Last of Us 2 it is going to play a vital role. It's actually going to add way more verticality to the game, which is something that I think will ultimately kind of lend itself to the idea of having more options at your disposal on how exactly you want to take on larger groups of enemies. Another major mechanic that they've added, and again this is where the stealth aspect comes in, has to do with you're able to go prone now. So when you are in these bigger environments, there's going to be areas where there's tall grass, you're actually going to be able to go prone, and apparently there's a bunch of different animations. You can go on your back, and everything based off of what I've read from the media impressions and people talking about how the game felt, the animations and the transitions are some of the best they've ever seen. It's buttery smooth and it's just very fluid, so when you're actually trying to go from prone to running, or if you're running and you have to go to prone or to crouch, if an enemy spots you and they're coming close to you, you're able to maneuver comfortably without feeling like the controls are clunky or cumbersome. And so that's something that I think a lot of people are really going to care about, because a lot of times when you play these games, one of the biggest things that can get in the way is just how clunky it can feel to utilize certain mechanics within games. And if there's one thing I think we can all agree on based off of the footage we've seen and that we're looking at now, is that this looks like one of the smoothest, best animated games we've ever seen. But moving on from that, apparently enemies this time around are actually going to provide a much greater challenge in terms of AI. They're going to be much smarter. It's actually not just human enemies, but also the clickers. It's not going to be as easy as the first game. Because these environments are bigger, because you have more options at your disposal, naturally, the reactions from enemies are going to be much greater. They're going to be much sharper. And one of the things I've seen that the media talking about is just how they actually were surprised at just how intelligent the AI was, right? It surprised them just how quickly they were able to figure out what they were trying to do, and they would try to flank them and kind of surround them. Ellie, that's the section of the game that we're playing here, apparently one of the earlier sections. Probably should have mentioned that in the beginning, but this is something that is a huge improvement over the first game, where the enemy AI in the first game, I think was pretty good, but in this game, in The Last of Us Part 2, it's going to be taken up to another level. And again, the same goes for clickers, so clickers are going to actually be a little bit more of a challenge this time around. And actually, another thing that they mentioned is apparently a new enemy is going to be dogs this time around. So this is going to be a big deal when it comes to the gameplay, because it's going to add a whole new dynamic. It doesn't seem like it at first, but the people who were playing the game pretty much said that the introduction of having dogs pretty much made it so that you have to stay on your toes. The dogs are going to behave much differently than humans. Obviously, they can actually detect your scent, and they will be able to detect your movement much more easily. And once they discover you, it's actually apparently pretty challenging to take on a dog, because they're attacking you, and you also have human enemies that are now alerted to your presence. So to me, that gets me pretty excited. I'm going to be really interested to see just how dynamic the gameplay becomes once if it's going to be one of these situations where you're taking on a group of enemies, and then suddenly a new set of enemies comes in and they have a dog with them, and suddenly you're like, uh-oh, now I really got to pay attention. And so something else we can expect, and this kind of plays into the AI changes that we're going to see within the game as well, is apparently there's going to be a whole new level of depth when it comes to the actual personality of the enemies and the way they react to one another. Apparently one of the biggest things that people walked away with from the gameplay impressions is that when they would, for example, take out an enemy that had a dog, the dog would actually react to that and then suddenly become very sad, visibly sad, where you could see it was distraught, it was confused, it doesn't know what's happening. And apparently, psychologically, this was having an effect on some of the people playing the game, naturally, because it's one of the most realistic games out there, apparently. And the same is going to happen with human enemies, where if there's a group, you do something to one of the enemies, and then another one of them is going to react by calling their name and genuinely acting shocked and distraught. And it's just going to add this level of emotional depth to the enemies, where one of the core themes of this game is are you going to become the monster yourself through your quest of vengeance? And so adding this level of, I guess you could say, emotion to the enemies, and adding weight to every kill you get, every time you're taking on a group of enemies, you're going to experience something. I think that that's actually really cool, and this is, again, something that Naughty Dog really put a big emphasis on, where at first it doesn't sound like a big deal, but once you're playing the game, once you're in it, the amount of destruction that you're going to, the amount of rampages you're going to have to go on in this, they want the player to feel like there's a sense of weight to that, and a big part of that is going to be the emotional depth between the enemies and the groups and animals as well, their animal companions. And to me, that just sounds actually really awesome, because if there's one thing that I think The Last of Us Part 2 is going to do better than any other game, is just have that sense of emotional grounding, and to me this kind of backs that up. But moving on from that, we're going to talk about apparently a new clicker mutation, which is very interesting to me. Apparently there's one that's going to be called a shambler, which is going to be like a tank-like clicker that's actually covered with thick armor plating, and apparently they are completely immune to any type of stealth attacks or stealth melee attacks, and they are very tough to take down. On top of that, apparently when you get close enough to them, they spray a cloud of some type of acid that will damage you, and I'm assuming you would need your gas mask on to maybe, well, since it's like an acid, I guess it's going to hurt your skin, right? So it doesn't really matter if you have the gas mask on or not. But apparently they are very tough to take down and extremely dangerous and tough. They become even tougher when you're actually facing them in close quarters. It's an enemy that apparently, according to the people who played the game, they say you need to keep your distance. So that sounds really awesome. I think we may see it in the gameplay. If we don't see it in the gameplay, I know that we've seen it in the trailer. So there's a new enemy type. I'm sure that's one of a few that we're going to see, which sounds very awesome. And the final thing I do want to point out here that is a big deal, because a lot of people, I think are going to be a little bit surprised by this, but maybe not, because we are playing as Ellie. There's no more Shivs. this time around. So no longer are you going to have to craft shivs. You're actually going to have an unbreakable switchblade. It's Ellie's switchblade, and I think that this is a big deal because a lot of people, look back at The Last of Us 1, and that was one of the biggest components when it comes to combat, is making sure you have enough resources to craft enough shivs, having those shivs for those moments when you really need them. This time around, though, you're not going to have to worry about that, but I also don't think that that means the game's going to be easier by any means. It just means that the stakes this time are much higher. There's going to be a lot more enemy encounters, and again, bigger environments. This is something that I think that they didn't really want players to have to worry about. So that's pretty much going to do it for the video, guys. Some of the big gameplay changes that so far I've heard of. I'm sure there's more. I wasn't able to get every piece of information, but these were the things that really stuck out to me, and so I thought it would be worth taking time to relay this information to you guys. But at this point, I want you to let me know your thoughts about this down in the comments below. What of these gameplay changes here, which one really sticks out to you most, and which one do you think is really going to make the biggest difference in how the overall gameplay feels? The one thing I do want to mention here at the end that I, again, probably should have mentioned in the beginning, but everybody who's played this game so far says that it pretty much feels exactly like the first game in terms of overall gameplay feeling. They haven't deviated to the point where it's unrecognizable. It's like a completely different game. It plays like a completely different game. It's still, and you can just tell by looking at the gameplay, it still has that Last of Us feel, but it has some major improvements and some major refinements done to it, to where it stands on its own as a new thing, but still feels very familiar. It still feels like The Last of Us. I thought it was worth adding that here at the end because I'm sure some people were concerned about that. But that does it for the video, guys. Let me know your thoughts down below. Leave it a like if you enjoyed it or found it helpful. Subscribe to the channel if you're new. Hit the bell notification icon so you never miss a video, and feel free to share this video out on top of all that. But until next time, guys, take care.